This is the extraordinary true story of Ajax, a war elephant in Alexander the Great's army, and his unwavering dedication to General Crateros, one of Macedonia's most trusted commanders. Set against the backdrop of Alexander's Indian campaigns in 326 BCE, it chronicles a journey that would become legend, a 6-day, 300-mile odyssey through hostile territory, undertaken not by a human hero, but by an elephant who understood that some bonds are worth dying for. When the dust settled after the fierce battle of the Hydaspes River, Ajax faced an impossible choice between military duty and personal loyalty. What he chose, and the incredible journey that followed, would prove that the greatest acts of heroism sometimes come from the most unexpected sources, and that love, in its purest form, recognizes no boundaries between human and animal, between rider and mount, between two souls who have shared the trials of war and the quiet moments of peace. When General Crateros fell unconscious from his wounds, his war elephant Ajax made a decision that defied all military training. He went home. The Battle of the Hydaspes River raged with unprecedented fury that scorching day in 326 BCE. Bronze clashed against steel, war cries echoed across the muddy plains, and the air itself seemed to bleed under the merciless Indian sun. Alexander the Great's Macedonian forces had met their match in King Porus and his mighty war elephants, creatures so massive and terrifying that even Alexander's legendary cavalry horses refused to advance. But Ajax was different. He had served in Alexander's campaigns for 8 years, from the dusty plains of Persia to the snow-capped peaks of the Hindu Kush. His hide bore the scars of a dozen battles, and his intelligent brown eyes had witnessed the rise and fall of empires. Most importantly, he had carried General Crateros through every one of those campaigns, their bond forged not just in battle, but in the quiet moments between wars, when the grizzled general would share his rations with him and whisper stories of his homeland Macedonia. Crateros was more than just Ajax's rider. He was Alexander's most trusted general, a man who had stood beside the young king since the very beginning of their impossible journey to conquer the known world. At 53, he was old enough to be Alexander's father, and indeed, many of the younger soldiers looked to him as such. His weathered hands had guided Ajax through the treacherous mountain passes of Afghanistan, across the burning deserts of Persia, and into the dense jungles of India, where strange birds called from canopies so thick they blocked out the sun. The battle had started at dawn, and by midday, the ground was churned into a crimson mud that sucked at the feet of men and beasts alike. King Porus, mounted on his own magnificent war elephant, had proven to be a tactician every bit as cunning as Alexander himself. The Indian archers, with their bamboo bows that stood taller than a man, sent flights of arrows that darkened the sky like flocks of deadly birds. It was during the third charge of the day that disaster struck. Crateros, leading a flanking maneuver around the Indian left wing, found himself separated from the main force when a group of enemy elephants broke through the Macedonian phalanx. A Persian archer, fighting as an ally of King Porus, drew his bowstring to full length and released an arrow that found the gap in Crateros's bronze breastplate just below his left shoulder. The general swayed in his howdah, the ornate wooden platform strapped to Ajax's broad back. Blood began to seep through the joints of his armor, staining the lion-skin cloak that marked him as one of Alexander's inner circle. Ajax felt the change immediately. The firm pressure of his knees against Ajax's neck, the gentle guidance of his ankles behind Ajax's ears, the steady confidence that had directed him through countless battles. All of it was gone. Crateros slumped forward, his bronze helmet sliding from his graying head to clatter against Ajax's skull. His breathing became shallow and labored, and when Ajax turned his massive head to look back at him, he saw that his eyes had rolled back, showing only white. The sounds of battle raged around them. The clash of weapons, the screams of wounded men, the trumpeting of other war elephants. But for Ajax, the world had suddenly narrowed to the weight of his unconscious rider. Every instinct, every hour of training, every command beaten into him over 8 years of military service demanded that he continue fighting. The Mahout who had trained him in India before he was captured had taught him to obey, to charge when commanded, to never abandon the battlefield. But as Ajax stood there, feeling Crateros' life ebbing away with each labored breath, something deeper than training took hold. He remembered the night in the Hindu Kush when Crateros had shared his blanket with him during a blizzard, when he had been shivering so violently that he couldn't sleep. He remembered the morning in Persia when Crateros had spent his own water ration to clean an infected cut on his leg, going thirsty himself so that Ajax might heal. He remembered the gentle way Crateros spoke to him, not with the harsh commands of a military trainer, but with the soft words a man might use with a beloved friend. Ajax made his choice. With a trumpeting call that rose above the din of battle, he turned away from the fighting. Enemy soldiers scattered before him as he began to move, not in the trained charge of a war elephant, but with the determined stride of a creature with a purpose all his own. Behind him, he could hear Macedonian voices calling out in confusion and alarm. "Ajax, where are you going? Return to formation." But Ajax did not return. Step by massive step, he carried his unconscious burden away from the battle, away from the commands of men, towards something that called to him more powerfully than any military discipline. Home. The first challenge came within hours. The Hydaspes River, swollen with monsoon rains, stretched before them like a brown serpent winding through the landscape. Its waters moved with deceptive speed, carrying uprooted trees and debris from the mountains. Ajax had crossed many rivers during the campaigns, but always with engineers and bridge builders, always as part of an organized army. Now he stood alone on the muddy bank, Crateros growing weaker with each passing hour. He tested the water with one massive foot, feeling the current tug at his ankle. The river was deep, too deep for him to simply wade across while keeping Crateros dry and safe. But Ajax was more than just muscle and bone. He was intelligent, with a memory that could map every trail they had traveled, every river they had crossed, every mountain pass they had navigated. Moving upstream, he found what he was looking for, a place where the river narrowed between two rocky outcroppings, where fallen trees had created a partial dam. The crossing would still be dangerous, but it was possible. Ajax entered the water slowly, feeling for secure footing on the rocky bottom. Halfway across, the current caught him, and for a terrifying moment, he felt himself being swept downstream. But he dug his feet into the riverbed, using his massive weight as an anchor, and pressed forward step by careful step. When he finally hauled himself up onto the far bank, water streaming from his gray hide, Crateros stirred for the first time since the battle. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and fever-bright, and he mumbled something in Greek that might have been Ajax's name. Then he was unconscious again, but Ajax had heard enough. He was still alive, still fighting, and that was all Ajax needed to know. The jungle that stretched before them was unlike anything in Ajax's experience. This was not the organized wilderness of a military campaign, with cleared paths and scouting parties ranging ahead. This was nature in its rawest form, a green maze where every shadow might hide a predator and every vine might conceal a trap. The canopy overhead was so thick, that only scattered beams of sunlight penetrated to the forest floor, creating a twilight world where day and night seemed to blend together. Strange birds called from the treetops with voices like human laughter, and somewhere in the distance, Ajax could hear the coughing roar of tigers. The air was thick with humidity and the smell of rotting vegetation, making each breath feel heavy in his lungs. But Ajax pressed on, guided by an internal compass that pointed steadily northwest, toward the mountains that separated India from the familiar lands of Persia, and, beyond them, Macedonia. He had traveled this route before, in the company of 30,000 soldiers, but the landscape looked different when seen from the perspective of a solitary refugee. Landmarks that had seemed permanent and reliable now appeared strange and threatening. On the second day, the fever took hold of Crateros in earnest. He began to speak in his delirium, calling out orders to soldiers who weren't there, reliving battles from years past. Sometimes he spoke to his long-dead wife, sometimes to Alexander, sometimes to his father, who had died when Crateros was still a boy. But most often, he spoke to Ajax himself, his voice weak but filled with affection. "Good boy, Ajax," he would whisper, his hand moving weakly to touch Ajax's neck. "Take us home, my dear friend. Take us home." Ajax found himself responding to these moments with gentle rumbles from deep in his chest, the sounds an elephant father might make to comfort a distressed calf. When Crateros shivered with fever, he would use his trunk to pull broad leaves from the jungle plants and drape them over him like blankets. When he grew thirsty, Ajax would find streams and use his trunk to bring him water, drop by precious drop. The third day brought new dangers. Ajax had entered the territory of the Assassinians, a fierce mountain tribe that had never bowed to Alexander's rule. They were known to be hostile to any travelers, particularly those associated with the Macedonian army. Ajax's military gear, the bronze fittings on his howdah, the lion skin trappings that marked him as one of Alexander's elephants, made him an unmistakable target. He first became aware of the watchers late in the afternoon. There was no sound, no visible movement, but Ajax's senses, sharpened by years of warfare, detected the subtle wrongness in the jungle around him. Eyes were upon him, studying him, calculating. He could smell human sweat and the oil used to treat leather armor. Somewhere ahead, men were preparing an ambush. Ajax's response was neither flight nor fight, but something more subtle. He began to move with exaggerated lameness, favoring his left front foot as if he had been injured. He lowered his head and allowed his trunk to drag, the picture of an exhausted animal at the end of his strength. To the hidden watchers, he would appear to be exactly what he was, a creature carrying a dying man, no threat to anyone, worthy of pity rather than attack. The deception worked. When the Assassinian warriors finally showed themselves, stepping out from behind trees and rocks with spears and axes in their hands, their leader took one look at Ajax and his unconscious burden and made a gesture that needed no translation. They stepped aside and let him pass, but Ajax's relief was short-lived. As he climbed higher into the mountains, leaving the jungle behind for rocky slopes and thin air, Crateros began to fail more rapidly. The wound in his shoulder had become infected, and despite Ajax's efforts to keep it clean, he could smell the sickly sweet odor of corruption. His fever dreams became more frequent and more violent, causing him to thrash in his sleep in ways that threatened to throw him from the howdah. On the fourth night, camped in a narrow valley between two peaks, Ajax made a decision that went against every instinct. He used his trunk to carefully lift Crateros from the howdah and place him on the ground beside him, then lay down himself, curling his massive body around him like a living wall. It was a position of ultimate vulnerability for a war elephant, one that would make it impossible for him to fight or flee if predators appeared. But it allowed him to share his body heat with the shivering general, and to monitor his breathing throughout the long, cold night. It was during this night that Crateros spoke most clearly, his fever temporarily breaking in the hours before dawn. "Ajax," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the mountain wind. "You should leave me, old boy. Save yourself. Go back to Alexander." Ajax responded with a sound that was part rumble, part sigh, pressing his trunk gently against his chest. Even in his weakened state, Crateros understood. "No," he said, and there might have been a smile in his voice. "No, you won't leave me, will you? Stubborn elephant, just like me." The fifth day brought them to the high passes, where the air was so thin that both elephant and man struggled for breath. Here, the temperature dropped dramatically as night fell, and Ajax found himself facing a new challenge. Crateros, already weakened by fever and blood loss, could not survive the freezing mountain cold without shelter. Ajax had never built anything in his life, but intelligence and desperation combined to make him an architect. Using his trunk and feet, he gathered stones and arranged them into a windbreak. He pulled dried grass and small shrubs from the mountainside to create a nest-like bed where Crateros could rest, then covered him with his own body as much as possible, using his bulk to block the worst of the wind. It was here, in this makeshift shelter high in the mountains of ancient Afghanistan, that Ajax came closest to giving up. His own strength was flagging after 5 days without proper food or rest. His feet, unused to traveling such distances over rocky ground without the metal shoes provided by Alexander's engineers, were cut and bleeding. Most crucially, Crateros was slipping away. His breathing had become so shallow that Ajax had to press his trunk to his chest to feel the faint flutter of his heartbeat. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, Ajax's remarkable memory provided salvation. He remembered this pass, remembered following this same route during Alexander's retreat from India the previous year. Just over the next ridge, if his memory served, there was a way station where the army had camped, a place with fresh water and shelter from the wind. More importantly, it was on the main route between India and Persia. There might be other travelers there, perhaps even Macedonian soldiers who could help. Summoning his last reserves of strength, Ajax lifted Crateros as gently as he could and began the final ascent. Each step was agony, but he pressed on, driven by a love that transcended species, a loyalty that made the impossible seem merely difficult. As the sun rose on the 6th day, painting the peaks around them in shades of gold and rose, Ajax crested the ridge and saw below him the most beautiful sight in the world. A cluster of white tents arranged in the precise pattern of a Macedonian military camp. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and he could hear the familiar sound of men speaking in Greek. Ajax's trumpeting call echoed across the valley, a sound of triumph and desperation combined. In the camp below, heads turned upward, and he heard voices raised in amazement and disbelief. "Is that... It can't be. Ajax! It's Ajax!" The elephant who had carried his wounded rider 300 miles through hostile territory, across rivers and mountains, through jungles and deserts, finally allowed himself to collapse at the edge of the camp. Macedonian soldiers rushed to help, their faces mixing wonder with concern as they carefully lifted the unconscious Crateros from Ajax's back. "By the gods," breathed one of the soldiers, a grizzled veteran who had served with Crateros for 20 years. "How is he still alive?" How did he? He looked at Ajax, who was lying on his side, utterly exhausted, but still watching over his rider with protective eyes. This elephant, he saved his life. Alexander himself arrived within hours, having ridden hard from his winter quarters when word reached him of Ajax's miraculous appearance. The young king, conqueror of half the known world, stood in silence for a long moment, looking down at his unconscious general and the elephant who had refused to abandon him. 6 days, Alexander said quietly. 300 miles through enemy territory, alone. He placed his hand on Ajax's trunk, and he responded with a weak rumble of recognition. You brought him home, didn't you, old boy? You brought him home. Under the care of Alexander's personal physicians, Crateros slowly recovered. The infected wound was cleaned and treated, the fever broke, and color gradually returned to his pallid cheeks. But it was Ajax who truly healed him, simply by being there when he woke, his great brown eyes watching over him with the devotion of a lifetime. When Crateros was finally strong enough to speak, his first words were not for Alexander or his doctors, but for the elephant who had saved him. Ajax, he whispered, reaching out to touch his trunk. My faithful Ajax, did you really carry me all that way? Ajax's response was a gentle rumble that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, and Crateros smiled. The first real smile anyone had seen from him since before the battle. Then we are even, my dear friend. For you have carried me through more than just these mountains. You have carried me through every battle, every campaign, every moment when I thought I couldn't go on. And now, when I had nothing left to give, you gave everything for me. The story of Ajax's incredible journey spread through Alexander's army like wildfire, and from there, it traveled the ancient world. Soldiers told it around campfires, merchants carried it along trade routes, and scholars recorded it in their histories. But more than just a tale of adventure, it became something deeper. A testament to the bonds that can exist between human and animal. A reminder that loyalty and love recognize no boundaries of species or nation.